a lot. I'm really happy to be here. Such a wonderful place and university, and with such a weather. I mean, this is a luxury. So instead of presenting a new paperwork, I thought of doing more of a review of what I have done in Latin America and kind of a reflection of questions that have no answer yet, probably never, but a way to reflect on from what we know, what would be useful for other regions or for theory in general. So what I'm going to do is first to emphasize some singularities of the family patterns in Latin America and see how do they fit or don't fit in the prevailing demographic theories, and whether from this fit or not fit, we can conclude that there will be an eventual convergence worldwide, or that each region, society, or even social class will continue diverging for a long time. And also a little bit of what can we learn from these Latin American patterns, both theoretically and policy-wise. I excuse myself because I'm going to talk about Latin America as a whole thing, and of course there's such a diversity inside, but I'm going to try to summarize like with a big brush. I mean, things that then, when you look at them in detail, they are very different, no? So in all the talk, inequality is going to be a central issue because we find really polarized societies in all dimensions, economically, socially, politically. If you follow political development in Latin America is really polarized. And of course, demographically, I mean, demography is just family lives. I mean, it depends on the context. So if there is polarization in other dimensions, it could be really rare that we don't have it demographically. A lot of the graphs that I will present, they are done with colleagues, Albert Esteve and Andrés Felipe Castro-Torres from SED in Barcelona. And a lot of the review things is published recently in the annual review of sociology. First, I want to say why I'm interested in Latin America. I'm from Spain. There are several reasons. There are links of affection. I mean, I think to study a region, you have to have some emotional links, be it family, friends, or having spent their time, and you have to have something. I have it. But also, I think it has an empirical interest. I mean, you need to document things worldwide. It has a theoretical interest because it doesn't fit exactly with the Western theories. Has a socio-political interest because, I mean, things are developing a little bit wild in the world, and family central for all these right-wing populist parties or movements. So it's important to have the facts right. It's also important for me to incorporate Global South perspective. I always work with Latin American colleagues, and I learn a lot from them because they tend to have a more critical perspective than in the US or even Europe, no? And also a practical thing. There's a lot of data. I mean, so it's a good way, it's a good region to start. I did the wrong thing. Data. What do we have that is comparable? Of course, there are a lot of surveys, country surveys, but the nice thing is there are many comparable things, data. We have demographic and social surveys, the VHS, the World Value Survey, the Latino Barometer is also interesting. We have the harmonized census microdata of of IPUMs. And recently, we have, it's emerging, but I think it's going to be a trend in the next decade, longitudinal family and child service. Right now, I think we only have them in Uruguay, Chile, and Colombia, but that's, I think it's a trend. They are mainly child service that are following a cohort of children. And I think it's going to be a very interesting the data source. And then there is also an emerging tendency of Latin American countries to join the Gender and Generation program. Right now, it's Buenos Aires did a pilot, but Argentina, I mean, it's not very well economically, so they didn't do I don't think they can do now a national survey. And Uruguay has just finished the GGS survey last year, and the data are available for all. Okay, I like to put some pictures. This is a really good photographer from the beginning of the 20th century, from Peru, and it's on the web. I mean, if you look at the photographs, they're beautiful, and it has all these series of families that maybe it's a poor context, but they are portrayed with a lot of dignity. And you can see some things just by looking at the photos, but there are a lot of children, but it's not a nuclear family. And you can see that there are probably some uncles, some unmarried sisters. I mean, it just portrays kind of family that has changed a lot, but not in this dimension. I mean, we will see it later. Extended family links are quite strong still. So the overall picture of Latin America is a very rapid fertility decline from the 60s, so it's a late onset, but extremely rapid. From 6 children, now the average is 2 children. And there is even an emergence of slow fertility. We have Uruguay with 1.3 children, Chile also with 1.5, Cuba 1.14. They have a very recent national fertility survey. And Puerto Rico, even if it's not a country, but I was surprised to find that it was 0.9, almost like South Korea. So, I mean, it's something that probably 20 years ago nobody would thought that Latin American countries would have same fertility as South Europe, no? So let's start with the singularities. One of them is that there is this emerging sub-replacement fertility. Some countries are going to slow, but childbearing remains to be quasi-universal. Even with very low TFR, the percentage of women that end up a reproductive span without children, compared to countries with the same level of fertility, is much lower. So that, I mean, this is more anthropology, but probably the value of motherhood is quite different here than, for example, I compare it a lot with South Europe. And it's still a very, the imaginary of women, motherhood is more important than in other regions. I have seen there are some exceptions. For example, in Cuba, I've seen in the report of the fertility survey that I don't think they allow you to have the microdata, though I'm pushing for it. Women end up with 13% are childless when they are 50, and men 24%. That's a lot. So that's an outlier because it's not that common, and we have seen that historically childlessness was high, but it was for other reasons, and then it went down, and now it's increasing, but just a little. This pattern is the same in Spain. Spain, the cohorts that were born at the beginning of the 20th century, but childlessness was more than 1/3. And right now, it's also 1/3. So it did like this, and for totally different reasons, but it's not something new. I mean, historically, we have had periods with where a lot of women were, and men were childless. Another singularities, there has been a rapid fertility decline, but no postponement transition, and that I think is unique as a region. When we see in this graph, we have since 1940, these are cohorts born in 1940 to 1980. First sex, more or less the same. In some countries it's younger now, but I mean more or less the same. First union, no change. First union could be marriage or cohabitation, but it's mainly cohabitation. And first child, the same. These are women that have a first child by age 18, and it goes from 30% in some countries to 60%. So there's a lot of early motherhood. And that's unusual, departs from many other, usually if you have low fertility, you have late fertility. It goes together, not here. And this stability, I mean, it's only apparent, but aggregate stability, it has happened in a context with a really large expansion of women's education and increase in labor force participation. I mean, education for the cohorts that were born in the 40s and the 80s, I mean, it's just increasing. Right now, there is advantage. Educational advantage of women are more educated than men, but these are aggregate trends. I mean, why education didn't work as an engine of transformation as other countries, social transformation, family transformation, why not? If we dig a little, we will see there is a segmented educational system. A private, high quality for elites that are small, and public low quality education. And that's not enough to have a social transformation. Okay. So since we have early childbearing and mean age of motherhood that has not changed, the same for fatherhood. What happens? The women's reproductive trajectory is very different than in other countries because mainly they start early and they stop early. I mean, because the ideal family is 2 children. So they don't space a lot, have first child, second child, and stop. So they stop childbearing in the mid-20s, when in Spain you are still living with your parents. I mean, this is very, and you start having children at 30 something. So it's a very different trajectory. And congruent with this, the first contraceptive method is sterilization. I think in the US it's also very high, but like in Europe it's very low. So, and this is in a context of high union instability and many second and third and fourth partnership. But women are already sterilized. So it's, I mean, from outside looks like if you have another partner, maybe you want another child, but I mean, you have been sterilized. We have talked of aggregate numbers, but of course, it's not the aggregate hides a lot of variation, and many countries have this bimodal age specific fertility shape, like a camel, like the model ages for fertility, they are the young ones. And then these are for low educated women, but high educated women. They follow the same pattern that more developed societies, they have it late. So there's a really class divide in reproductive timing. So the aggregate hasn't moved, but educated women are postponing. But since they are a minority in the population, you don't see them in the aggregate statistics. So this you can see country by country, only women with university education postpone motherhood. The rest that have elementary or secondary education, basically it hasn't changed. Another singularity is the large proportion of children born outside marriage. This singularity is not new. It's historical, it has been there forever. I mean, but it has increased now. So these are census data, it's 13 countries aggregated, and it's just a summary graph. But you can see in the 70s, 75 of children were born within marriage. This is lower than in Europe. I mean, Europe is only more recent that there is the level is now is more or less half and half. But in the 2000, it's below half of the population that has children within marriage. Most of these children are born in cohabiting unions, but 15% outside union, meaning there is no man around. I mean, it's solo mothers. These are mainly adolescent fertility. Something interesting is that these family patterns are maintained after migration. So we have a study in Spain and births to Latin American women, and we compare with the for each country, I mean the patterns in each country and the patterns in Spain. And they have their births later than in the country of origin for sure, but it's like 4 years earlier than Spanish women. So there is still, in a context of very hard economic resources, because I mean, migrants are, they find less, I mean, worse jobs, worse salaries, they don't have the family networks, but still the ideal of, not early because it's the mid-20s, but I mean, they don't adapt, I don't know, it's adapt, I mean, they don't follow the super late patterns of Spain that are, first birth is now 32 for women and 35 for men, so it's quite late. And also they have more children outside marriage than Spanish, and Spanish has changed a lot. In Spain now is 50% of births are outside marriage. That's the average in the European Union. But Latin American women residing in Spain, it's more than 60%. So I don't, it's still too soon to know what happens with second generations, because migration is relatively recent and second generations are still too young. But we have asked like adolescents in schools from Latin America compared to Spanish, and their ideal fertility is same than Spanish, 2. Then they have 1, but I mean the ideal is 2. And the ideal age of first birth is lower. Not as low as in the country of origin, but quite lower than Spain. And these are 1.5 or second generations in Spain. Of course, all this is stratified by social class or level of education. Women with college education, most of them have their children within marriage. Though it's changing, but nothing compared with less educated women. But still, there is a trend of having children within cohabitation or even alone. So another singularity is the dual nuptiality system. I mean, cohabitation and marriage have been cohabiting or coexisting. I wouldn't say for decades, it's for centuries. I mean, so there has been an increase now, but it has been there always. That varies a lot for the countries. I mean, like Caribbean and Central American have always have more than half of the unions cohabitation. And other countries have low cohabitation, like Mexico, and now it has increased a lot. Brazil has increased a lot, but it was always there. And actually, for data, like the Mexican census and many more, they distinguish marriage and cohabitation since the 1930s. I mean, I don't know in other censuses, but has been not until the 80s or 90s, I suppose, that they make this distinction. So in most Latin American countries, it's made very early. I found the 1930s, but maybe it's even previous, no? And so that's another singularity because we're used to talk about cohabitation like beginning in the Nordic countries in the 60s, but then there's another kind of cohabitation that has been there for centuries. These are the maps. By regions, there's a lot of variation. I mean, because there is a lot of cultural, historical factors, economical factors. But we see in the dark red that means more than 90% of unions of women 25 to 29 are cohabiting unions. So that's we are talking of very, very high levels. And it's not common that a cohabiting union transforms to a marital union. Like in Europe, it's more common. Here is the risk of dissolving is higher than the risk of transitioning into marriage. And as I was saying, this all these family patterns, they reflect very large differences by social class. There is an historical pattern of disadvantage because you can see like educated women, they are starting now to have children outside marriage, but before it was in the 80s, nobody. I mean, maybe 1%. I mean, it was non-existent. And now it's increasing at the same level. So you can think, well, this is a diffusion from bottom to top of behavior, not like in the Nordic countries, there was the educated people that started to cohabit and then it diffused the whole population. But also you can think of it of two types of cohabitation. The traditional one, that is because you don't care. I mean, you don't have property. Why should I marry? I mean, I'm in informal work. I don't have any papers of anything. So what is the point of getting a paper? And the rights right now are more or less the same. I mean, on paper. Most countries have done enacted legislation, so consensual unions and marriages have the same rights on paper. I mean, then it doesn't work, no? But the meaning of cohabitation for high educated women is more like in Europe. I mean, it's more second demographic transitions, autonomy. I want individualism against tradition, but only in this elite group. Because of all these things, there's very high levels of single motherhood. There's also a class divide. You enter single motherhood through lone motherhood alone. The father is not, doesn't, many cases doesn't recognize the birth. Now there's legislation where you can, they believe you. I mean, your word is enough to say this is the father, and if the father wants to complain, this Costa Rica and other countries, there is a free DNA test, but they believe your word. That was not the same before. So, and also because of high rates of separation, of divorce. What happens? Are these lone mothers? They are alone. I mean, of course, poverty rates among single mothers are really high, as everywhere. But we find international correlations. 70% more or less, on average, of single mothers live with their grandfathers. And if there's no grandfather, with uncles, with sisters. I mean, there's a family safety net there. So how do these trends fit with the prevailing major demographic theories that we are used to read or to frame our analysis with? For sure, in the 70s or 60s, the new home economics based on specialization, I mean, it doesn't hold anymore for, I don't think, any country. But in Latin America, it was never in place. I mean, there was a real specialization was never in place, except in the middle classes or upper middle classes. But basically, because it's too risky, and people realize that with one salary, not one salary, very low and stable salary, you cannot survive. With high union instability and very low level of child support because it's rarely enforced, the risk is high. And so, I mean, you cannot specialize in care work because people realize it's too risky. So there was women have work, always. Not high status women, but they have work, but in the informal, so they were not counted. I mean, the statistics now are trying to include all informal work, but it's not easy. Okay, second demographic transition. We have some features that fit and some others that don't. So, what do we do? Some replacement fertility, almost. I think in a decade or so, most countries will be below 2 children. Not yet. I mean, there's some countries, Guatemala, Libya still is a bit high, but 3 something. But then we have lowest one. Postponement transition, still no sign of it. I mean, there's no, I mean, I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but there is no sign. It has not started. Only among elite people, that is very minority. Increasing voluntary childlessness still is not there. It might happen, but we see very few signs, only in some countries and among very, I mean, privileged groups, college educated with a lot of resources. Cohabitation, yes, has a different meaning than other countries. It higher level, but it's not modern in the sense that has been given to other countries. For sure, the decoupling of marriage and childbearing, yes, it holds totally. High levels of human instability also holds. And the high prevalence of single mothers holds, but in a different way because they live with their family. So it's not exactly the same than in other countries. So what about the pattern of disadvantage? I think that, the main argument is that material and financial constraints shape all these family patterns. I think this fits well, but it's not really a theory, it's just more an observation. And we find this not only in Latin America, but in Europe too. Disadvantaged groups tend to have more births outside marriage, more cohabitation, more multiple partner fertility, more adolescent fertility. All these indicators, they are very different depending where you are positioned in the social class spectrum. So this social polarization of family behaviors, of course, then it may amplify existing inequalities in children's life opportunities. So I think it's very clear in the Latin American context, in others too, but I think there is very clear. So what is different, if I had to summarize what is different with the so-called West, every motherhood, now it's not a question of access to contraception because there is enough access. Before it was interpreted as a lack of access to quality contraception. Now I think it's most countries access is even subsidized or free by the government. But it's more the idea, probably, is more cultural, that low-educated women with no big hopes because there's no intergenerational mobility. So no hopes for the future, they are going to stay as they are. So perhaps motherhood is perceived as a source of love and meaning to their lives. Has to be something more cultural there. And it's not access, it's not having access to contraception or craziness. Having a child. There is also a lot of abortion. So even if it's not legal, access to abortion is there. So it's not really unwanted. So we still have to learn a little bit more on that. Single mothers is just super prevalent, and it's not fueled by welfare dependency, as they used to say in the US in the 90s. I don't know if still they argue this, but it's not welfare dependent, it's the lack of welfare. It's totally the opposite. It's not too much welfare, there's no state support at all. And another lesson is that increasing family diversity and complexity is not limited to the global north. We're used to say, second demographic transition, families are becoming more diverse, more complex. But in Latin America, for decades, the whole 20th century, we have single mothers, post-separation families, blended families, multi-partner fertility, something that is studied now in Europe like relatively modern, and it has been there forever. So, of course, we have divergent destinies, but the difference that these family trajectories have been diverging across social classes for centuries, or at least for decades, nothing new. Some of the contextual factors that may explain these singularities, I have put some of them. Of course, everybody knows that this is one of the regions with the highest inequality. So there's large contrasts in living conditions and life opportunities, and this really conditions everything. Your work life, your health, your family life, absolutely everything. The poorest 50% owns only 1% of the wealth. So, I mean, you own nothing. It's not only wealth, because the inequalities interact with other inequalities along the lines of gender, race, ethnicity, geography, rural and urban. There is a lot of disparities. You have a very rigid stratification system with very limited intergenerational social mobility, really, really low. So that's why I'm saying many people know that they have no future. I mean, they know it from the very beginning. This is in part linked to this segmented access to quality education, that the majority don't have access to quality education, and also to high levels of informality in the labor market. On the aggregate, ILO says that half of the workforce is in the informal market. I mean, half. It's just a lot. And women, more than half. So working means something different. Another factors that are different in the Latin American than other region is there has been a limited secularization. In the 60s it was 90% Catholic. Now it's 25% is evangelical. It has been a big change, and non-religious is 25%. So we know that evangelical churches are very conservative in family views. In fact, Catholic even look progressive now compared to evangelical churches. They have a very weak and fragmented in many ministries social protection system. Most people have no access of it just because of bureaucracy. So many are left out. Above all, the workers in the informal economy that are half of the working population. So it's a lot. Something that is different also and conditions a lot family life is violence. Violence against already vulnerable population and impunity. I mean, if you have read about Mexico, I mean, there's such a violence, killings, and nobody goes to jail. I mean, it's like 3%, I think they are caught. I mean, it's really impunity in all countries. So there is armed internal conflicts. Before it was guerrilla and guerrilla, and now it's narco. So violence comes from the state, from the narco, from the social, sometimes from the family. So in the Latino barometer, the statistic is that 44% of Latin Americans reported having been a victim of a crime in the previous year. So that's a really high level. When you ask, for example, migrants in Spain from Latin America, why do you come to Spain? I mean, of course, I want to have more resources. And one of the main reasons is I'm fleeing violence. I mean, I can live with violence, but I don't want my children to live in a violent context. So it's a very important fact. And of course, there is a high level of violence against women. 1/3, according to the DHAs, have suffered anytime physical or sexual violence. That's a level that is quite high. And the progress towards gender equality is very slow. The norm still is the male breadwinner model, even if it's not possible, and we have seen there is not real specialization, because I mean it's impossible to live on one salary. And a large caretaking gap between women and men. The advance has been extremely slow. And there's a lot of father absence in the family because of union dissolution, because migration, or because non-recognized births. I mean, there are several reasons, but this is changing. So there is a new fatherhood in some countries. Uruguay, we have a study that are very involved with their children, even after separation, but it's not the norm. So it's like we have the tale of two societies. I mean, we have polarization in socioeconomic status and, of course, in family lives, and it's normal. So, because of the absence of public safety nets, you are in the informal workforce, you don't have unemployment insurance, you don't have health care, you don't have a pension, and the state doesn't guarantee your child support payments. The level of child support payments is relatively low. We only study Uruguay, that is a high, relatively rich society, and I think less than 40% of parents are paying child support for their children. And after 3 years of separation, of course, if you go to 10 years, probably maybe it's 10%. So what I think is that family have to develop survival strategies to cope with this economic uncertainty. And this includes all kinds of strategies. It could be child fostering, co-residence, pooling resources across generations, gender selective international migration. First you go, you try, and then maybe I join you. I mean, there is all these strategies to survive because you don't have any state support. So is that all these patterns and trends lead to relatively paradoxically situations from the outside, no? Like, for example, in post-Catholic, they call it post-Catholic because now there's few, the percentage that people that are religious is low, though you have a Catholic cultural mentality in South Europe. So like Libby Batch is saying, too much family leads to too few children. That's the situation in South Europe. Strong families, but you want the best for your children, a lot of family obligations. The response is very few children. In Latin America, it's not the same thing, but it's a very weak welfare system and very family and friendly context leads to fragile and very complex families, but strong kinship ties, because you have to survive. So it's not even a cultural thing, it's a survival strategy. And I finish, this is just a photo from a movie. If you haven't seen it, I recommend to see this. Roma is from 2018. Director is Alfonso Cuarón. And it's a beautiful movie, but very hard at the same time. And you can learn a lot about gender and ethnic and social class divides in that movie that's beautifully photographed. So thank you very much. If you